One way to solve the problem in the last video is by using inheritance. So in our application, we can create a new class called articles listbox that extends the listbox class. Similarly, we can create a new class called title textbox that extends the textbox class, and the save button class that extends the button class. Now, how is this going to solve our problem? Well, this articles listbox needs to know about the title text box and the save button. Because when we select an article, the title text box needs to be populated and the save button should become enabled. So in this class, we can implement a method called changed. This gets called when we select an article. In this method, we're going to have code like this. We're going to tell the text box, hey, this is your new content. And then we're going to enable the button. Now, the title text box needs to know about the save button. So in this class, we can implement a method called changed. This gets called when the content of the text box changes. And in this method, we can disable or enable the button. So if the text box is empty, we want to disable the button. Otherwise, we want to enable it. Now, the save button needs to know about the title text box, because when we click this button, we want to store the new title in the database. So over here, we can implement a method called clicked. In this method, we can have code like this. We get the content of the text box and then update the database. So here's one way to solve this problem using inheritance. Now, the problem with this approach is that as our form or dialog box gets more complicated, we're going to have a lot of connections or dependencies between these classes. And as you can see, the logic behind this dialog box is spread all over the place. So if I want to figure out what is happening under this dialog box, I have to look at different classes. Now, as this dialog box becomes more complicated, understanding it and maintaining it becomes really difficult. So let's clean all that mess. We need a better approach. We're going to ask the person who designed this framework to make a slight change in the UI control classes. So we want all these UI control classes to talk to an abstract class called dialog box. So every UI control should know the dialog box that contains it. So in this class, we can have a field called owner, and the type of this field is going to be dialog box. Now we can introduce this field in the base UI control class, so we don't have to repeat it in every UI control. Okay. Now, in this class, we're going to have an abstract method called changed. This gets called whenever any of these UI controls gets changed. For example, when the content of the text box changes, this class is going to call the changed method of the dialog box. Now, this method has a parameter of type UI control, and this represents the object that was changed. So the text box calls the dialog box and says, hey, I am changed. Now, with this structure, we have a single place to figure out how these objects interact. So our logic is not going to be spread all over the place, okay? Now, as I told you, this dialog box is an abstract class, because in this class, we don't know how the controls on a dialog box are going to interact. This is an abstract concept. How these objects interact will change from one dialog box to another. So in our application, we're going to create a new class called articles dialog box that extends the abstract dialog box class. In this class, we're going to implement the changed method. And this is where we implement all the interaction between these objects. And this is what we call the mediator pattern. The reason this pattern is called the mediator pattern is because this dialog box is mediating the interaction of these objects. So they don't know about each other, they only know their mediator. Here's the classic structure of this pattern. We have this mediator class, which is an abstract class, that is like our dialog box. And we have the concrete mediator that extends this class. This is like our articles dialog box. Now, we have this colleague, which can be an interface or an abstract class, and this is like our UI control. We can have multiple concrete implementations of this interface, and these are like our list box, text box, and button classes. Now, in this structure, these concrete colleagues do not know anything about each other. They're completely isolated from each other. They can talk to each other indirectly via a mediator. So with this structure, we can reuse these classes in different contexts. We are not coupling a list box to a text box or a button. The only type of coupling we have here is the coupling between the concrete mediator and the concrete colleague. And this is perfectly fine because in a particular dialog box, like the articles dialog box we definitely need to know about the controls we have on that dialog box. So the articles dialog box needs to know that we have a list box for representing the list of articles. It also needs to know that we have a text box for the title of each article and a save button. So this type of coupling is perfectly fine. All right, next we're going to implement this in code.